Well, hello everybody. I would like to start kind of our seminar now. My name is Willem Jansen. I'm a lead agricultural economist. I'm very pleased to chair this session because of some special memories that I have to pulses. It's kind of in the 80s, I worked as an economist at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture in Colombia. And one of my responsibilities there was to kind of to accompany the bean program in its quest to change the kind of bean production in the world. I thought we were pretty kind of successful in it, but there is still a lot left to be done. That's also good because that provides kind of room for people like Douglas to continue with his excellent work. Before going on, I would like to kind of to outline a few of the rules of the game that we want to kind of to maintain in the seminar. First, we would like Douglas to kind of to make his presentation before we start coming in with questions. It said last week I was in a seminar where they started to ask questions after 5 minutes and the speaker was never able to finish. And we want to avoid that. We want to have the full story before we start coming in. Then for those of you that are on the webinar and that are kind of listening online, you can please send your questions through the chat. And then we will make sure here that you get a chance to put them through. For those of you that are in the room here, you have a more difficult job because you will have to recall what you want to ask. But I'm pretty sure that we will be able to do that. What I understand is we have about 20 people in the room and we have 55 online, so we have a rather good audience. And that's also because we have a very interesting subject. We're going to be talking about pulses. The heroes of nutrition and agricultural sustainability. And pulses is a kind of a group of crops that everybody agrees that they're very important. Everybody agrees that they have very many useful benefits. And then, for one or another reason, they may not get the attention that they should. And that is the point that I would like to leave with all of you before we start. Kind of, what can we do to make sure that pulses play the role that they can play, that they get the importance that they really have. They have lots of contributions to make. I'm very pleased to introduce Doug Cook. He will be speaking, he will be making the presentations on the seminar, and he has a CV that's really impressive, and I can only kind of get to it by reading it out. He has been working on basic legume science for the last 18 years. His research spans model and crop legume systems with a dual focus on genetics, biochemistry, and cell biology, and on ecological genomics and the associations to understand gene functions in a complex natural and agricultural legume systems. So it's very much about, on the one hand, the genetics and how those come about of the legumes, and the other hand, about how those play out in the environment. Doug received his doctoral degree from the University of Wisconsin in medicine, in bacterial genetics. He then worked at the Carnegie Institutions of Washington's Department of Embryology at Johns Hopkins, and he worked for 8 years at Johns Hopkins, at Texas A&M, before moving to the University of Davis, where he has been a professor since about 16 years. We have an eminent speaker here, and we look forward to listen to his talk. Doug, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem. I want to start by thanking the folks at the World Bank and the folks here in Washington and the folks at the UC Davis World Food Center who has invested a lot of time to organize this seminar. I'm going to try to do two things in my talk. I'm going to spend about half the time talking about legumes in the broad sense. We'll start by talking about what is a pulse, for example, and setting the context in terms of legumes and larger agricultural challenges, the context that legumes fit into. And then I'm going to spend the second half of the talk talking about an example of a large international project that my group leads that takes some of the principles that I will have discussed in the first half and looks at how we're trying to apply them. My goal is not to talk about the science, but instead is to talk about the big picture, but also to talk about where science fits into trying to solve some big picture questions, particularly in legumes. So the first question is, what in the heck is a pulse? Because in some parts of the world, you say pulse and people know immediately what you mean. But in other parts of the world, in the U.S., for example, you say pulse and they put their hands on their wrist. They don't know that you mean a plant. So what is a pulse? Well, pulses are legumes. Not all legumes are pulses. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But all pulses are legumes. And legumes are the third largest family of flowering plants in a botanical sense. Slightly more than 18,000 different species in the family, so it's a large family. And several dozen of those have been domesticated by humans over the last 10,000 years to become key components of our agricultural systems. Some have global importance, others have regional importance. But in all cases, they're fundamental to the systems in which they operate. They're second only to grasses in the global sense in terms of their agricultural importance, in terms of yield and acreage devoted to them, for example. And they're a keystone family in nutrition. And I'm going to come back to that again, but I want to make 2 points. They're extremely important to human nutrition, and they're also extremely important to soil nutrition, and as a consequence to the nutrition of crops that grow in or after in the same fields in which legumes occur. So they enhance the nutritive value of the crop for consumption as well as for future agricultural systems. Now, so what is a pulse? Well, like I said, pulses are not all legumes. Pulses are not all legumes, but all pulses. Well, anyway, so what are they? They're the legumes that we eat, from which we eat the seed. So they include things like lupin, which is the top one here, fava bean, chickpea, Mendel's garden pea, cowpea, which is important in sub-Saharan Africa, lentil, which is globally important, but particularly in India, common bean, which comes from South America and is becoming globally important. And these are all legumes where we typically don't use the dry part of the plant as fodder. They're primarily used to eat the seed. And that's what a pulse is. But pulses also include a couple of other legumes that I want to put on the table as pulses, but are not traditionally called pulses. And this is peanut and soybean. These are oilseed crops, generally speaking. But they're also consumed by humans. It's not their major role, but clearly, if we want to call pulses things where humans eat the seed, peanuts and soybean also fit in. And there are a large number of other pulses. These are the major ones. But there are perhaps twice this many that have been domesticated and are important in agricultural systems in different parts of the world. It doesn't mean that they're not quantitatively important, by the way, because in a given region, any one of these crops, or even the more minor ones, might be the main source of legume nutrition in a village or in a given region. Why legumes? Why are we concerned about legumes? Why do we even care what pulses are? Well, in part, the answer is what I just told you, and that is they're important agricultural systems. But more importantly, the fundamental feature that distinguishes legumes from other crops is the fact that they're very, very good sources of protein nitrogen. And they provide about 30% of nutritional nitrogen in the human diet globally. They provide more than that on a percentage basis in parts of the world where animal protein is not high, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa and India. And this comes from the high protein content of their seed. How do legumes get high protein content? They get high protein content from a biochemical process, a biological process that's unique to legumes. Legumes are the only species in agricultural systems that are able to fix nitrogen. What do I mean by that? Well, about approaching 80% of the atmospheric gas content is nitrogen gas N2, which is inert. But forms of nitrogen are essential to biological productivity of all forms, between animals, plants, microbes. And so we need access to that form of nitrogen that's present in the atmosphere. And the way that access is achieved is through a process called nitrogen fixation, in which nitrogen gas is converted into ammonia and then into organic forms that organisms use to build their biomolecules. That ammonia, another way of looking at it if you're an agriculturalist, is its fertilizer. Legumes have the ability to make their own fertilizer through interaction with a microorganism called rhizobium. And so in that symbiosis, they convert nitrogen gas into ammonia. And as a consequence, legumes have ready access to what would otherwise be a limiting supply of a vital agricultural input, namely ammonia, reduced nitrogen. They have their own fertilizer. And they end up with high protein nitrogen content in their seeds as a direct consequence. And an ancillary benefit of that is legumes enrich the soil in nitrogen, because when they die and they leave material in the soil, detritus that becomes part of the soil system, they also enrich those soils in nitrogen. And humans have known this for a long time. Initially, without understanding the process, they knew that growing a legume one season, followed by grass the next season, led to higher productivity of the grass. And the reason is that legumes enhance the soil nutrition as a form of biological fertilizer. So nitrogen fixation is a defining feature of legumes, and it's really sits at it's really the reason why they're important in agricultural systems. Now, it turns out that this issue of nitrogen in legumes has broader implications. We know in the developed world, where we have intensive agriculture, and we have inputs of water, for example, or soil manipulations, including fertilizer input, that we can't get good yields unless we have those kind of inputs. So the input of nitrogen into agricultural systems is a fundamental reason for high and sustained yields. But in the developed world, it doesn't come from legumes. It comes from industrial processes that burn fossil fuel, particularly gas, to drive nitrogen fixation in an industrial sense. And this has consequences. It's responsible for about 4% of all energy-related CO2 production globally. It's a major cost of agriculture. Approaching 20% of the cost of agriculture in the developed world has to do with the provision of reduced nitrogen through fertilizers that comes from the burning of fossil fuels. And importantly, the misuse and the overuse of nitrogen in agricultural systems is the primary contributor to one of the most significant ecological problems on the planet right now, and that is the imbalance of nitrogen. And so legumes sit at this nexus where better use of legumes, more frequent use of legumes, could help solve not only nutritional problems through increased protein nitrogen, but also problems, ecological problems, environmental problems that derive from what is arguably humans' most elaborate activity, and that is agriculture, and providing nitrogen to make it productive and sustainable. This unique property of legumes happens on their roots, a little bit of biology. Happens on a specialized organ. These bumps shown here on that root are called nodules. They're basically houses where the bacteria that fix nitrogen live, and they set up little fertilizer factories that produce nitrogen for the legume and to enrich soil. You can see the consequences of not being able to fix nitrogen if you're a legume in the bottom right-hand corner here. That's a soybean field. And there are two types of soybean. Soybean that's been inoculated with an efficient symbiotic organism, and they're fixing nitrogen well. They're dark green. And soybeans that weren't inoculated with an efficient strain of their symbiont, and they're not fixing nitrogen. They're chlorotic and they won't yield. So nitrogen fixation has important consequences for agriculture, and legumes use it effectively to increase their yield. Now, humans have another way to sort of look at the importance of legumes and pulses is to look at the history of agriculture. It's about 10,000 years ago that humans settled down into agrarian communities and started to take the crops that previously they had more or less foraged for and bring them into organized agricultural systems. I mean, every place in the world where domestication occurred, or the major domestication events, involved the co-domestication of grasses and legumes. And it wasn't just a happy circumstance that happened. There's functional reasons for that. In the Middle East and southeastern Turkey, for example, chickpea and Mendel's pea and lentil were co-domesticated with emmer wheat and barley. The co-domestication happened not only because legumes were important in terms of human nutrition and needed to be in their diet, but also because growing legumes one year, or in conjunction in the same year, in the same field, with grasses enhanced the productivity of the grasses. And so this close marriage between grasses and legumes has been going on throughout the history of agriculture. And it's only been supplanted recently as we've started to use industrially derived fertilizers, which has, as I mentioned a minute ago, benefits but also consequences. So legumes continue to be important in essentially all agricultural systems and all agricultural systems around the world. Because we eat legumes as a source of protein and nutrition, they become a delivery vehicle not only for their high protein nitrogen content, but also for the other nutrients that are contained in them. And that's actually a good thing because legumes are often very good sources of iron, for example, which is the absence of iron in the diet is a major source of one of the major factors in malnutrition around the world. So legumes become a pill, in essence, that seed, not only for nutritional nitrogen, but for the other elements that are in the legumes. And that means if we're thinking about improving legumes or modifying agricultural systems that include legumes, we need to think more broadly, not just about nitrogen, but about nutrition, for example, and about all the other elements that seed can provide that makes them nutritious. Okay, so just as sort of context. So, feeding a growing world. This is a problem in agriculture broadly, and legumes have a place in it. I just want to mention a few of the challenges because they'll be relevant as we go through the talk. One of the things that I think everybody is aware of is we have a large growing population. We're approaching, in fact, about 7.5 billion people right now. That growing population is malnourished to significant extents. About 1 billion people around the world are chronically malnourished. That's roughly 1 in every 7 or 1 in every 8 persons. And by chronically malnourished, I mean that their access to nutrition is a severe deficiency. It has lifelong consequences. The absence of adequate nutrition during early development, for example. There are large disparities in populations around the world, in not only the numbers of people, but their growth, the growth rates of those populations. Most of the growth over the next few decades will occur in the largest population centers of the world, China and India. But the fastest rate of growth will occur in sub-Saharan Africa. And these things pose challenges. It's not only changing demographics, but it'll be changing and increasing needs. There's a disproportionate distribution of capacities, whether it's at the level of education or the ability to deliver solutions or to even take those solutions up around the world. And there are disproportionate distributions of income. And, of course, all of these things are tied together. They're not separate factors. But they have to be taken into account if you're thinking about trying to use legumes or any other aspect of an agricultural system to impact outcomes around the world. There's an urgent need to increase the efficiency of agricultural systems. And we have to do this while reducing environmental impact. The amount of land devoted to agriculture, although I don't have a number in my head, is very large. It certainly, arguably, could be the most perturbing thing that humans do to the natural environment. And there are consequences. I mentioned nitrogen, but water also. Many big picture things are tied directly to agriculture. And as we think about feeding a growing human population, and arguably we're not meeting that requirement even at 7.5 billion people, think about when we get to 9 or 10 billion. As we think about doing these kind of things, we're going to have to expand agricultural capacity, but we can't do it with increasing land. And one of the reasons is we've essentially maxed out, or very close to it, the amount of efficient arable land. So these are challenges that have to be taken into account. And as we're doing this and increasing production, we clearly have to reduce the negative impacts of agriculture on our environments, whether they're human-built environments or whether they're natural systems. What we're doing right now is not sustainable. And what I'm saying is not hyperbole. It's really a fact. How we do that is another issue. It's complicated at many, many levels, but it's certainly issues that we need to consider. There are also long-standing challenges to agriculture, things that have been a problem since the dawn of agriculture that still have to be dealt with if our systems are going to be efficient. We have to make sure our crops are disease-resistant and that epidemics don't wipe out production in a given year in a given region. We have to have plants that can tolerate environmental extremes. Drought is the single year-in, year-out major constraint in agriculture broadly across the planet. And it's going to become more severe as global change, and particularly increased temperatures, which is not a debatable issue in scientific communities, as increasing temperatures continue to influence rainfall patterns and water distribution around the world. We need to be concerned about inputs, whether it's nitrogen or water or high-quality soils. I just mentioned changing climate, but increasing planetary warming is a big issue, and it needs to be dealt with if we're thinking about the future of agriculture. And that's going to be typified by more extreme climates, particularly increases in heat and less predictable weather. Part of the solution is we need increased investment in research and development. And this is one of the themes that I want to try to pull out, because it's not, I can say it, but I can assure you that I can be in rooms with people who have different perspectives about it, who might not think that research is the place to invest in order to achieve outcomes and solve problems. And I want to make the case that one of the places we need to invest, and we must invest, is research, along with all of the other things that we need to be doing simultaneously. Okay. With respect to legumes and thinking about those big challenges, we have an additional big challenge, and that legumes have been massively underinvested. I hope I've convinced you that legumes are key components of agricultural systems. They're not optional components in diets. They're not optional components in sustainable agriculture. They're really essential features. It's why legumes were co-domesticated with grasses at essentially every major domestication event in the world 10,000 years ago, and they continue to be relevant in our modern agricultural systems. But we've underinvested in them. During the Green Revolution, the majority of the investment went into a minority of grass species. And most arable land in the world, or the largest fraction of arable land, is devoted to the production of grasses. And the most resources in terms of crop improvement and at either both fundamental and applied sciences has occurred in the grasses. And legumes have been underinvested. They've been pushed into marginal lands because the best lands have been given to the grasses. And legumes can tolerate that to an extent because of their capacity for nitrogen fixation. They can bring with them the ability to make poor soils good soils, for example. But they've been underinvested and underappreciated, and we need to reverse both of those trends. It's really quite important. Another sort of interesting thing that's happened is that legumes' comparative advantage is the ability to provide protein nutrition and other nutrients that come with eating nitrogen. In the developed world, legumes as a source of protein has become less important because we eat more animal protein. But producing animal protein to feed 7.5 billion people is also not sustainable and not realistic. Legumes are much closer to primary production, and they're a better source of nitrogen for a large fraction of the human population. So, and here there are sort of social issues and preferences that relate to how we get our protein. Okay, so I want to switch just a minute and talk about the one theme which is important in my research but important in agriculture generally, and that is the impact of limiting supplies of water. So I already made the point that year in, year out, access to adequate water is the major factor limiting agriculture. And there are several reasons why water is limiting. You know, you could say it's global warming, and this certainly contributes to things, but fundamentally it's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem really has to do with human demography. It's a consequence. Limiting water is a consequence of how much water is coming into a system through natural processes, and how much water is being taken out through human-driven anthropogenic processes in agriculture or other issues. We can see around the world that limiting water supplies, for example, on the Colorado River in the United States or on the Yellow River in China, that those large water supplies that have historically supported human populations are no longer adequate. If you look across large time frames, you will see that water becomes limiting, and there are serious problems that occur. And the recent drought in the western United States is a good example of that. There's plenty of water, but there's not enough water to feed the distribution of our populations, and maybe not at the right times of the year. 70% of fresh water used by humans is used for agricultural purposes. So water is intimately tied to agriculture, not only for productivity of the agricultural systems, but for the sustainability of the water supplies themselves, because typically our use of water in large population areas exceeds local regeneration rates, and these are significant problems. And so irrigation alone is not sustainable. We need crops, legumes included, that are more efficient in terms of the way they use water in their systems. 66% of the human population, about 4 billion people, live under severe water scarcity at least 1 month of the year. And 500 million people, it's year-round. So it's sort of like the nutrition problem I described. Same kind of scale, 1 billion people under severe malnutrition. These are big picture questions. And of course, legumes aren't the solution to all of it, but they're a component of the solution because they're a component, an important component of agricultural systems. So this is just a quote from an article that occurred in press earlier this year, and it says, "Meeting humanity's demand for fresh water, protecting ecosystems at the same time will be one of the most difficult and important challenges of this century." And I don't think it's an understatement. It's not just about agriculture, it's not just about science, it's about policy, it's about investment, it's about many, many things. But agriculture has a role to play, and science in developing agricultural systems that are more efficient clearly has a role to play. Because I'm at the World Bank and because we think about trying to deliver solutions that impact humans in parts of the world where they don't have the same benefits that they might have here in the United States, for example, I want to say something about the disproportionate impact that it's clear climate is going to have in the developing world. And this is information from a friend of mine, Dan Sumner at UC Davis, who's an agricultural economist. He put this together for me. So the changing climate is going to have disproportionate impacts on the parts of the world that are already the most at risk because they have limited resources, limited capacity, limited infrastructure. Close to the equator, we're going to see the biggest impacts of climate change, increasing temperatures and variable rainfall patterns. Why is there going to be the biggest impact? Well, these places are already hot to begin with, and they're just going to get hotter. So they're already in places where stress on agricultural systems is high. And they're more dependent upon agriculture than the rest of the world, in the sense that larger portions of their population are devoted to agricultural production. In Ethiopia, for example, 85% of the population are involved in agriculture. And the vast majority of those people are involved in hand-based agriculture. They're smallholder farmers. They're highly at risk from these situations. They have lack of infrastructure to adapt to changes. Particularly smallholder farmers are really disconnected from markets and other processes that might give them some buffering and sustainability. And there's lack of capital investment. They can't afford the inputs that might make those systems more effective. As increasing temperatures take this already precarious situation and make it not only more vulnerable, but that vulnerability becomes expressed as negative outcomes, commodity prices are going to go up because food's going to become limiting. That'll be great if you're living in the developed world and you can produce lots of food because you'll benefit from the increased commodity prices. But in the developing world, where production will decrease in the absence of solutions, those increased commodity prices will have consequences. Witness the recent food crisis of 2008 when prices increased substantially. These kind of factors, I don't know exactly which ones, of course, but they will continue to play out. And they will be of more severe consequence in the developing world. So there are lots of factors involved. Now, the problem is not just about of climate and heat and water. It's not just about water. And I want to make this point. This is an important point to make because if we're thinking about where to invest, and we might be looking at changes in large global challenges like water or nutrition, and think, well, I just need to solve the problem of water or nutrition. And the point I want to make is, particularly in agricultural systems, it's not that simple. These are highly interrelated systems. We can't solve one problem without solving the other. So drought, heat, cold, all climatic issues, pest and disease, nitrogen fixation if you're a legume, the nutrient content of your seed, they're all interrelated. And here's an example taken from Ethiopia. And it's an example with a crop called chickpea that I'm going to use as an example later in my talk. In Ethiopia, where chickpea is grown extensively, about 40% of sub-Saharan Africa's legume production, they plant chickpea when the rains are finished. And that exposes the crop to terminal drought. In other words, water is likely to run out before the crop is finished producing. Why not plant earlier? Why plant after the rains are done? If water's the problem, plant when there's more water in the soil. The reason you can't plant when there's more water in the soil is if you do, you get hit by disease. Soil seedling diseases which respond to soil moisture. And this disease here, called ascochyta blight, it's a foliar pathogen. It will take 100% of the yield of your crop away if you plant when the water that you need is available. So as a consequence, you wait until the rainy season is over, and then you plant. And it's a race to finish production before the water in the soil dries up. Now, there's a consequence to planting late. It's not just that you expose the crop to terminal drought. You also expose the crop to late-season diseases. Fusarium wilt and pod borer insects become extremely important factors late in the agricultural system, particularly as moisture becomes limiting. So you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't. And agricultural practices in Ethiopia and other parts of the world, with respect to chickpea in this case, are dictated by the environment and the interaction with these other factors. You can't solve one without solving the other. And this is, I think, really, really important to recognize. Okay, with respect to legumes, it turns out that their comparative advantage, nitrogen fixation, is also impacted by climate. And it's most problematic in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where climate is already extreme. Legumes don't fix nitrogen very well if they don't have enough water, if the temperature is too hot, or if soil nutrition isn't good, factors other than nitrogen. They will stop fixing nitrogen. And so the comparative advantage, the reason you have legumes in those systems, goes away if the systems themselves don't have other properties. And we need to develop legume crops that can be resilient to some of these stresses. So we have to think about this issue of, in this case, science for development in legumes in a broad sense. And we can't take a sort of very narrow view to things, because that narrow view won't get us where we need to be. I've already mentioned some of that. So how do we address these challenges? Well, I will mention the last point here. The power of investing in agriculture is clear. If you look at investment, this is from the Gates Foundation, agriculture has about a 4-fold increase in return in terms of development outcomes, anything else that you can do, at least as I'm not an agricultural economist, but certainly it's an important and useful way to invest. And so we need to think about investing in agriculture to try to help solve some of these problems. How do we do this? Well, it has to be multifaceted. We need partnerships across the board, from governments to private foundations, from fundamental scientists through applied scientists, including farmers and consumers. We need sustained investment. I think that's obvious, but we have to have a variety of investment time horizons. And this is, at least as a scientist, it's important because often we think about 3-year grant cycles. But that doesn't solve the problem if the problem is a century or decade-long challenge. So we need mechanisms that recognize and identify short-term priorities and short-term outcomes, but couch those in the framework of the long-term solutions that we want to see realized. We need to recognize the importance of scale. I mentioned drought as being the single year in, year out most important thing. But the fact is, in different parts of the world, drought may not be the primary driving factor. It might be disease. It might be soil nutrition. It might be the access of roads to deliver effective seed into the agricultural system so that farmers can produce. Or it might be the lack of connection to financial markets to the growers. So it's complex, and the specific issues that limit our systems and our ability to deliver solutions in different parts of the world is different. And on the one hand, we have to think big, but on the other hand, we have to recognize that the local constraints might be different, and we're going to have to, in many cases, deliver different solutions. And that's just the way it is. It's not a contradiction that they're both big picture issues and local issues. But if we don't recognize that, I think we won't achieve what needs to happen. And I'm kind of speaking to the choir here, I'm sure, but I think it's an important point to make. And we need to embrace diverse scenarios. I've mentioned some of these, but when we think about agriculture and legumes, we might not think about road networks and seed systems, but they're components of the system that'll make legume production effective and useful for the smallholder farmers, for example. Education, including formal education and simple training. How do you deliver fertilizer? How do you breed a plant? Diplomacy and capacity building, which are clearly not part of normal science, but are really important because they set the context for these big picture things. And if you don't engage more broadly, if you don't recognize that science, while it's part of the solution, is only part of the solution, and it may not be the driver in big picture discussions, if we don't recognize that as scientists, I think we end up having problems. But science still has an important role to play, and I want to spend the rest of the time talking about this. How is science used in service of development? If I'm talking to a development community, I know that it's not always accepted that investment in fundamental science has anything to do with development. Think about the money that it takes to sequence a genome. I'd much prefer to buy a bag of seed or make sure somebody has fortified seed in a particular part of the world. But is that actually a reasonable way to go about things? And I'd argue no. That in fact it's not a zero-sum game, and we need to recognize that we need to be operating at different levels to achieve different things. And science, even fundamental science, has roles to play. Imagine we want to bridge yield gaps, increase yield in different parts of the world with particular genotypes. How are we going to do that? Through breeding, you might say. But then I would say, you know what? We need more efficient breeding systems, and they have to be at the molecular level. And that has to be based on fundamental understandings of genes that control trait outcomes that we want. Pretty quickly, we connect back to basic science, and it's a continuum all the way through, recognizing the importance of different contributions at different levels. Increasing resilience to climate change or heat, drought, disease. These are important, difficult challenges. And they represent challenges in the fundamental sciences as well as in the applied sciences. We have to be working across those scales. Increasing sustainability. It's a scientific issue in addition to being a policy issue and so on. And we need basic science involved in the game. So I'm going to give you the example of chickpea, a legume, a pulse legume, by the way. Very important in the developing world, about third most important legume crop globally in terms of pulses. Very important source of human protein nitrogen in places like India, Pakistan, Ethiopia. And it suffers from limiting water. I've already talked about the issue of drought being interrelated to other factors, so I won't go into that anymore. But I just want to make a point that over the last few decades, although chickpea has been grown globally, this underinvestment that I mentioned underlies an important a couple of important facts, and that is the yields of chickpea have been stagnant globally, and there's a number of challenges that we haven't addressed effectively, particularly biotic stress, disease, insect pests, and abiotic stress, heat, cold, and drought. They need to be solved. We can see the consequences in a sort of direct way if we look at yields around the world. India is by far the largest producer and the largest consumer, but also the largest importer of chickpea in the world. Chickpea is a very important part of the diet in India for their protein nitrogen. But their yields, kilogram per hectare, are about 50% of what we find elsewhere in the world. That's a huge challenge and opportunity simultaneously. How do we improve chickpea production? We're trying to feed a country with a population of 1.3 billion people, where they really do have a very direct connection to chickpea and other pulses. Pakistan is the second major consumer, but their yields are about 1/3 elsewhere in the developed world. So this frames the challenge in the broad sense. You know, if the details about drought and heat and disease are difficult to grok, this isn't. There are big yield gaps, and there are consequences of that. And these are things that we need to solve. It doesn't just impact production locally. It impacts other things like trade and economics. Canada produces more lentil than any other country in the world and is the major exporter. That's great for the Canadian economy, and it's a good thing. They become very efficient at it. But you know, these differences in production and consumption have consequences beyond just agriculture. So trade is an example, economics. Well, one of the approaches that we've taken in our project that needs to be taken broadly and that I've already mentioned is to building partnerships. So we put together a multi-institutional, multinational initiative that involves 27 different partner institutions in 10 different countries. And we have a range of different partners involved as funding. Our main sponsors are USAID and the National Science Foundation. But we've managed to get funding from a wide range of other locations and different governments. In Australia, the Grains Research and Development Corporation funds a large related project. We have funding from Canada, from Norway. We interact with Russian institutions very substantively recently, with the Pakistan Higher Education Corporation, and we've started to interact with private foundations who have begun to invest in the project because they see that the challenges we're trying to address are important, that they could have impacts on the things that they've prioritized in their efforts. So Tata Trust in India, the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, the Two Blades Foundation in the United States, and Mars Incorporated have all invested in the project. So we span many different types of donors with different interests, all focused on a common thing, and that is improving chickpea, trying to address the problem of drought, but also recognizing that it's not just about water, it's about many other factors: heat, disease, cold, temperatures, things that vary regionally. In chickpea, one of the fundamental challenges is low genetic diversity. 95% of the genetic variation of that species exists in the wild progenitors of the crop. It's not in the cultivated system. And we know from phenotypic surveys that those wild systems have useful traits. They have drought tolerance. They have resistance to insect pests. They have altered nutrition. The question is, how do we get those important traits out of the wild systems and into cultivated, basically redomesticating the species? And this is, in a nutshell, is what the program is about. And so we're focused on the kinds of things I told you about: drought tolerance, heat tolerance, cold I don't have in here, but it's important in different parts of the world. Nitrogen fixation, how do we make it resilient and more effective? Plant architecture for mechanical harvesting, so that harvesting can be more efficient. Seed nutrient density, resistance to important plant diseases and insect pathogens. We have to work on all of these things if we expect to be able to solve any one of them because of the interrelationships that I mentioned earlier. And the way forward in chickpea, but also in other legumes, and in fact in plants generally, is genetics. How do you improve a trait in a crop? You find a useful trait value in some genotype somewhere, and then through breeding, through making crosses between plants and selection. Now, in today's scientific regime, that means selection at the genetic and genomic level, to try to generate the kinds of improved varieties with the kind of new properties that you want. And so breeding is important. The sort of novel approach that we've taken is to say, look, most of the variation that we need for breeding is not in the crop. It's back in the wild ancestor. And so we start from the wild ancestor. I want to bring up another issue that I won't talk about more, but biotechnology in the sense of genetic engineering Forget about how you might feel about it personally, because I'm just making a point about where useful variation can come from. I think the issue about how we set policy is a very, very different thing. But it's clear that biotechnology has a role. Pod borer, it's not only a significant problem in chickpea, it's the single major pest of cotton, the same species. When chickpea and cotton are grown near one another, both crops suffer. Pod borer resistance in cotton has been achieved globally through the use of a gene called the Bt transgene. It comes from a bacterium that makes cotton resistant, and it's been moved into chickpea in India, where there's a lot of debate about GMOs. But it can solve, at least in the near term, decadal periods of time, the problem of pod borer, which is a very, very significant problem. Now, whether it will make it into the marketplace, whether the public will accept it, whether the government will allow the policies that are required to make it come to fruition is a different matter, and I'm not talking about that. I just want to make the point that variation can not only come from wild relatives or from the crop germplasm, but it can come from more distant species. And the question about whether we're going to let biotechnology have the impact that it could have is an important topic for debate. But it could impact legumes. So in our project, we're all about genetic variation. We've gone into the place where the crop originated from, into southeastern Turkey, literally in a region called Mesopotamia, which means between the rivers. It's bounded by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, largely speaking. In southeastern Turkey, the lower boundary is set by the desert that leads into Syria, and the northern boundary is set by some natural mountains. So it's a small part of the world, about 100,000 square kilometers, and we spent a lot of time there collecting and conserving wild germplasm. And we've done it with sponsorship from different organizations. And trying to figure out, from that large collection of germplasm, where are the useful traits, and how do we get it in through breeding? And we've taken that material that's been collected and characterized at the genetic and molecular level, and we started crossing with a large number of international partners that wild material into cultivated material to be a huge genetic experiment that is going to be the beginning of breeding to address these different challenges. And we have many partners around the world with many different laboratories set up to take this material and begin to analyze it for disease resistance, for heat tolerance, for drought tolerance, for insect tolerance, for increased nutrition, for altered nitrogen fixation. It's a giant genetic experiment meant to change crops with particular objectives in mind that I've already mentioned. The other thing we started to do is work with international centers to access land races. These are the forms of agricultural species that existed about a century ago, but are no longer predominant in agricultural systems. And we know those land races, which were regionally distributed around the world a century ago, have important traits, but they're not being used in breeding programs effectively in large part, certainly not in chickpea. And so we started to interact in Russia with the Vavilov Institute in St. Petersburg, where they have a huge collection of wild relatives of chickpea from a century ago, and characterizing that material at the genetic level to understand which aspects of their collections that Vavilov made a century ago could be important in modern agriculture. We've done the same thing in Pakistan, where they have collections of land races. In fact, we've gone out with Pakistani collaborators and made collections. Pakistan's interesting because chickpea is grown in the Punjab region, literally in the desert. And this is from the tall region of the Punjab, which is, I don't know if you can see it here, but those are sand dunes. Chickpea is grown in the desert, and you only get crop when it rains. But drought tolerance is important there, and probably those genotypes that have been there for centuries have important traits for drought tolerance. Same kind of thing in Ethiopia. We're working with the Ethiopian Institute for Biodiversity to survey and understand the diversity present in hundreds of land races that are historical in that country. So I want to finish by saying, so we're thinking about diversity in chickpea. We're working with different partners. We have this sort of holistic approach in terms of traits that we're trying to address because of the interconnectivity of those properties. But there's more we can do. Typically, we want to think outside the box. What I mean by that? Well, here I'm referring to another group of organisms, not to the chickpea crops, but to microbes that live with chickpea. Every plant, in fact, every organism on the planet, is colonized by millions of microorganisms, including thousands of different taxa and hundreds of different species. Each one of us around the table has our own microbiome, microbial community walking with us. In humans, those microbes contribute important traits. A large fraction, for example, of our neurotransmitters are made in our gut by microorganisms. But they're our neurotransmitters. Dopamine, for example, which a significant fraction is made by microbes in the gut, not by our systems. Those organisms are part of the extended organism, and each one of us is part microbe, part human, and it impacts human health. It's a big area in the National Institute of Health, for example. The same thing's true in plants. Plants associate with millions of microbes, thousands of taxa. And we know that they impact all the properties I've been telling you about. Drought tolerance, heat tolerance, the ability to access nutrition from the soil. But we don't really know how it operates or which particular components of those complex microbial systems are important. But developing microbes that can be used in agricultural systems to address these challenges is a corresponding, relatively under-recognized but important opportunity, I think. So we need to think outside of the box, and we have a large program on microbes specifically with this in mind. Finally, we have to be able to implement and deliver. We can't just think about the big picture questions and recognize things are complex and that we have to have lots of partners. In the end, we have to be able to deliver across those scales. And this is an example of a place where we are very close to being successful. We started off in 2011, I believe, with funding from the National Science Foundation and a program called BREAD with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and started working on Chickpea and one of its microbes, its nitrogen-fixing symbiont. I won't go into the details, but outcomes from there were delivered to a USAID project, which has connections in both India and Ethiopia, and with national programs in those countries, both at universities and in national programs that would be the equivalent of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And finally, industrial partners that will take up the outcomes. This is a student who's leading this in Ethiopia. Her name is Zahara Damtu, in conjunction with a student of mine at UC Davis. They've conducted large surveys of the nitrogen-fixing microbes across Ethiopia and India. They're working with national partners there to run field trials to identify efficient systems for nitrogen fixation in conjunction with industrial partners who will take the outcomes of those experiments, scale them up, apply them, and deliver them to enhance legumes' comparative advantage, namely nitrogen fixation in agricultural systems. And we need to be able to do this with every outcome, not just nitrogen fixation, but drought tolerance, nutrition, and so on. We need connectivity across the scales that I mentioned earlier. So I'll finish here and just reiterate, legumes are important to meeting many of the challenges of the world. And it's not hyperbole, and I'm not telling you this because I'm a legume scientist. I know it because I'm a legume scientist, but I know it. They are key factors. They're cornerstone in agriculture. That's been the case historically, and it is certainly the case going forward. We need global coalitions. We need broad and sustained investment. We have to recognize that things have to happen at different scales. We need to make sure we use relevant technologies. If you don't need a rocket ship and a hoe suffices, use the hoe. If you need a rocket ship, then begin planning to have that infrastructure. We need appropriate goals, and we need delivery pathways. From the scientific perspective, we can't just think about the outcomes that we need in terms of the science, like solving drought tolerance. If you find a solution, how do you make sure that solution is adopted and used and that it's appropriate and relevant? And we need partnerships. And those partnerships have to be authentic partnerships. Groups will come with different interests. But we need partnerships. We need to think about technology transfer, capacity building, and so on. And all of these things have to come together in the package that makes things work if we're thinking about legumes in the developing world and trying to meet some of the large global challenges that I brought up early on. And I think that was my last slide.
Thank you, Dirk. Thank you very much. That was a real exciting presentation. We're very happy for you sharing your insights about the interaction between science and development. But it's also nice for us here at the World Bank to see the window being opened into what the scientific issues are at the moment. These were the things that maybe some of us were familiar with a long time ago, but not so much anymore. And so it's really good that we also get some insights in what's happening there. Okay, let's move on with the questions then. Let's open the discussion. And we have quite a large number of people online, and we have people here in the room. And what I would like to do also as a tradition in these type of sessions in the bank, we would like to start with the people online. So they may have been sending their questions. I'm looking to Aaron. And what I would like to do is I would like to ask Aaron that he presents the questions that came up through the chat.
Sure, glad to. And thank you again to everyone online who's been following along. There's also some very nice comments about the presentation, Dr. Cook, so congratulations. I'll offer you the option, let's say. So there's a few questions that come in. One is a little bit around the relationship between sort of nutrition and private sector, let's say, that includes legumes. Another involves a question on urban agriculture, and another one that I've seen is asking about differences in yield. Do you have a preference which one you'd like to go for?
No, you can choose. But the one point I will make is that some of those areas I may have an authoritative statement to make, and others I don't, and I'm going to be honest when the questions come in.
Fair enough. Perhaps since we're hosting this seminar in the IFC, we'll start with the private sector one, since that's a focus of the organization. And I know there's a couple, or at least one IFC colleague in the room who maybe might have a thought. But this comes from a question actually from another World Bank colleague who assists in the Brazil office in the ag practice. And that is, how do you see the transition from animals to vegetables in general if 5 big companies dominate the market in the world? Maybe this might play in a little bit to your partnerships talk, but do you have any comments in response to that?
I think probably there are a couple of questions embedded in that. How do I see the transition from animals to agriculture? And I assume that we're talking about what I referred to as the fact that legumes can, in fact, meet protein, nitrogen requirements that animals currently meet. This is a challenge, and I don't know the solution for it. I think that the importance of legumes in agricultural systems has been declining. And I think if you sort of look at the importance of pulses in particular, let's take soybean out of the equation, it's an oilseed crop, you would see that as economies become more sophisticated and more enriched, that they depend less and less on legumes as a source of nitrogen in soils and as a source of nitrogen for nutrition. In the United States, we don't recognize very effectively, I think, at least not the degree to which we should, the importance of legumes as a source of nitrogen nutrition, right? And so I think we need to recognize and support the importance of legumes in agricultural systems, pulses in particular, because this issue of animals versus vegetables and the importance of legumes really has to do with protein nutrition. And I'm guessing, I think probably this is more of a policy question than a scientific question. And I think, for example, in the United States, we need to make sure our nutritional standards put legumes on the same page as animal proteins. Right now, they're on the same page as lettuce. What's that about, right? In the developing world, we need to make sure that those systems are productive and effective so they can meet the needs of the people, or they will turn to other solutions. So I don't know if that answers that part of the question. In terms of 5 big companies, well, legumes, except for soybean, are not generally in their focus. I don't want to get into the issue about corporate agriculture, except to say that we're not going to feed the planet through a bunch of smallholder farmers. We have to have large-scale solutions, effective genotypes, and big investment. Now, whether that's 5 companies or 200, and whether it's multinationals or local companies, I don't know, that's for somebody else to decide. But to think that we can solve the challenges of modern agriculture without taking advantage of the corporate sector and letting the incentives that drive the corporate sector operate, I think we're in trouble. We have too many people on the planet. So I don't know how that'll play out, and I don't want to tell you what the answer is going to be. We'll have to invest at multiple scales. We need national programs operating to fill in where the big corporations don't. They're not picking up the pulses the way that you might imagine investment needs to occur. And so that's going to have to involve private foundations, places like the World Bank, U.S. universities, national programs in those countries. Different networks will operate. And I think this idea of the 5 big corporations is almost not relevant in the pulse discussion right now.
Thank you, Doug. I'd like to make two comments on that one because it interests me specifically. First of all, I think you also see at this moment a group of consumers arising, not only in the United States but also in other developed countries, that is going towards different kind of preferences, food preferences. So you have kind of a large group of people that are vegan or vegetarian, that want locally sourced food. And there you see kind of some changes in what they are consuming. One of the things would be kind of whether we can piggyback on that and get that kind of type of behavior kind of mainstreamed in society. It's not sure it will happen, but in many other cases it has. So that would be one thing. The other thing is, it's also important that, take a country like Mexico. They're rather big kind of pulse eaters. One thing that we need to work on is that they don't stop doing that. Kind of, let's say, a key point there is maybe not so much to encourage them to eat more, but let's make sure that they don't eat less than what they do at this moment. But I think these consumer issues are certainly very important. Now, before Aaron goes on with all his other questions, I would also want to know if there are people in the room here who would like to ask a question. Fabio, please.
Thank you, Dr. Cook, for that fascinating presentation. This is Farbod Yousefi from the Global Agriculture Global Practice here at the World Bank. I've always thought that pulses are less popular than they should be. A lot of the evidence that you shared with us today has been known for time back, but for some reason it doesn't have the popularity that it should. It's not proportional, its popularity, with the benefits that it provides. And I think there might be an issue at the marketing level. I mean, it doesn't have a good marketing strategy implicit that other boards, other products, other commodities have. Other commodities have strong boards, abundant funding available to them, and they're able to push their products. Horticultural produce have these advantages, nutritional advantages, and they've already generated the demand for their products. So we see that. But I'm wondering what could be done at that level, at generating more demand, where most of the effort could or should take place. Is it with governments? Is it with consumers, as Willem mentioned? Is it at a different level? Because ultimately, the demand for pulses and higher quality pulses will also drive a lot of the research and the funding and anything that can pull this product and make it more popular as a commodity that can be produced more widely. So any thoughts that you might have on generating demand or boosting demand as we become aware of the benefits?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is that the nature of the challenge differs in different parts of the world, and there need to be different solutions. And it's almost certainly going to be multifaceted. You asked, is it going to be government or commodity boards or consumers? It's going to be all of those things, I think. This is not an area where I'm an expert, but let me just make a couple of observations. In places like India and Pakistan, where the majority of the population's very large dependent on pulse legumes, it's not a matter of selling it to them. It's a matter of making those systems more efficient and dealing with the problems that would help solve some of their nutritional problems through legumes. So there is no need to think about changing habits and diets. There is a need to make sure we don't go the wrong direction with consumer preferences, and that's, I suspect, an issue of advertising, if you will, and policy. In places like Australia is an interesting example. Pulses are extremely important in Australia, and they're recognized and supported in the agricultural system. But it's not so much because they're good sources of human nutrition, it's because they're good sources of soil nutrition. And in Australia, it's a low-input agricultural system, and they use pulses to maintain sustainability of their grasses. And so pulses are well embedded and recognized, and I think stable there. In the U.S., I mentioned that in our dietary standards, legumes are not equivalent. They're not put in the category with beef and chicken and pork, where they really should be because of their protein content. They're put in the same category as lettuce. This is a marketing issue and a policy issue. How do we end up with, and I'm not trying to be political here, but just think about it in the abstract sense, how do we end up with policies that don't value legumes for their chief advantage, which is nitrogen? So there it's a matter of policy and trying to promote public consumption.
Hi, my name is Liz Adams. I'm the Technical Specialist for Agriculture at Global Communities. We're an NGO here in the D.C. area. And my question has to do sort of with the food preferences that you mentioned. I'm just wondering how much the change in sort of the concern over gluten and wheat products in the U.S. has, and other parts of the sort of developed world, I wonder if that's really driving any increase in demand for like chickpea flour or other sort of flours that are derived from pulses. I feel like that could be a space where you could increase demand and you could increase marketing and knowledge, and then therefore, maybe there'd be more money going into research or things to help with some of these other questions, for the developing space. So I'm just wondering if you've seen anything like that, or if that's relevant to any of your research.
It's not something we pay attention to in the research. I think it's an important issue that maybe other factors that change consumer preferences will lead people to use legumes more. It's not an area where I have a lot of knowledge. For sure, chickpea flour, the example that you used, is important in lots of parts of the world, and it's a good substitute for uses where flour happens. But in terms of quantitatively, how much of an impact that's having, my guess is that the biggest impact is going to be people who consume them in the more traditional ways, where they consume them as the bean, or as the bean in a more complex dish, for example.
I think it's a very interesting issue. Basically, what you find is that there is a group of people that starts kind of recognizing or that starts seeing superiority in these products, whereas before they were considered inferior. And kind of, let's say, there is a subjective element in that. There may also be some role for repositioning these products. And here your point on the dietary kind of guidelines that countries are putting out might become very important. Now, kind of thinking about it in developing countries, that might be an even tougher job, but it might also bring bigger rewards. In many developing countries, especially if you come out of relatively kind of undiversified diets where you eat kind of lots of certain products, you really like to have a piece of chicken on your plate at a certain moment, and it's going to be very difficult to stop that from happening. But let's say at the same time, if it could be made clear that these products are very nutritious, that they are very good, that they give you the same type of nutritional benefits at a lower cost, there may be a way of making sure that the consumption doesn't drop so much. I hear from Aaron that we have already 8 questions from our friends online. So I would like to ask Aaron to bring forward 2, and then we'll do the next question here in the room.
Sure, that sounds good. Yeah, it's getting challenging to keep up. Let me take a quick look on these. All right, so I'll try and hit on 2 that are not perfectly aligned, but similar enough, I think. The first comes from, and I apologize, I'm not able to get everybody's sort of location and institution, but at least have all of your names. The first from Dick Tinsley, who is a retired professor still associated with Colorado State University, and he had asked how much of the limited yield of chickpea that you were talking about during part of your talks is sort of based on being produced on residual water in developing countries, say, whereas more developed producers have the opportunity to use irrigation and use more water-rich sources in which to grow. And the second was a question from Ricardo Braun, who was curious whether you are aware of sort of research or application of growing using natural agricultural systems such as permaculture and agroforestry, and whether you had any opinions on those in terms of assisting with development impact through legumes.
Okay, let me answer the first question, then I'm going to ask you to repeat the second question. I'm going to ask you to repeat the first question, too, just really quickly.
Sure. The question was how much of the limited yield of chickpea...
Got it. That's due to drought. Yeah. So, it depends on where in the world that you are, and whether drought is the sort of year in, year out limiting factor. It's important most globally, but it depends on where you are locally. It's the major factor limiting yield. In the developed world, chickpea actually, in terms of legumes, is relatively drought tolerant. So it's typically not grown with water inputs in terms of explicit water inputs. We use natural rainfall. So in the United States, it's grown in the Pacific Northwest. In Canada, it's grown in Saskatchewan, for example, and the very large pulse production in Canada in particular. But it's not irrigated production, generally speaking. So we don't add water. But the need to develop crops, one of the things that farmers have done and breeders have done is to modify the growing season of chickpea, make it so it'll go to maturity quicker, make it so that it'll grow in different times of the year, in Canada during the summer, for example, in India during the winter. So there have been adjustments made to accommodate the issue of water, but it's normally not by providing water. I should say something, though. I showed you these large yield gaps, and I mentioned genetics as a solution. But clearly that's not the only solution. There are big issues that relate to agronomic practices that lead to low yields in the parts of the world where I pointed to low yields. And so genetics is just part of the solution. And the second question about agroforestry you'll need to repeat.
Yeah, it was just a quick question on whether you're aware of any research on how natural agricultural systems such as agroforestry and permaculture play into kind of legume production.
Well, I don't think they do. Not that I'm aware of to any significant degree. The agricultural systems are separate, not only spatially from the natural systems, but temporally. I mean, we separated those close to 10,000 years ago, and the challenges in agricultural systems are distinct from the challenges in natural systems. Disease, in many cases in agriculture, is a consequence of plant density and canopy architecture, things that don't occur in natural systems. So there's a lot to be. We're focusing on natural systems to try to improve cultivated systems, but I think in terms of functional equivalency, there is limited amount.
Okay, let's have another question from the room then.
I was also thinking in terms of sustainable agriculture systems, and you talked about efficiency in production. I'm wondering, what are the parameters around efficiency? Are we talking about use of non-renewable resources as a way of measuring efficiency, and whether our economic models that we're working with at the moment are really up for supporting the type of mixed agriculture and legume agriculture that we want? Have we got a bit of a problem with our economic models for promoting this type of agriculture you're talking about?
Yeah, somebody like Willem and others in the room will be better to talk about the economic models. How we measure efficiency, though, in fact, the fact is people will measure it differently depending on what they're interested in. And I think efficiency is different than sustainability, although they're not unrelated. But efficiency for me would be, it might be just whether you get, how much yield you get in a given year and whether the crop is efficient given the range of inputs that you make. And that's certainly one way to judge it. I think if we look at the production, the yields of agriculture in the U.S., for example, we think about outcomes, but not balanced against inputs, because we're not limited for the amount of inputs we can provide. We can afford it. But if you're thinking in the developing world, inputs become a key factor. And then the efficiency of the system becomes dependent on many things. The crop genotype, whether you had adequate rainfall, if you have access to irrigation, could you add nitrogen, is your nitrogen fixation efficient enough? So I think that the issue of how efficient is the system or how sustainable is the system will vary in different parts of the world. As far as economic models, though, I don't know, and I'll ask others in the room if they can address that.
I can make a very quick comment on that. I think you can look at it in two ways. You can try to understand from a kind of a conceptual level and kind of at a distance what the value of different systems is, and we would then come to conclusion that legumes have a lot to offer. On the other hand, you have the type of incentive system that farmers work under and that they respond to, and they respond to it in order to get the daily income and to feed the families and other reasons. It's not always so easy to reconcile those, and we're at this moment actually within the World Bank and also a series of other international organizations, we're making a major effort on that by emphasizing climate smart agriculture, where we focus on the triple win. And there basically we say, well, income growth by itself is not enough. But then we also say improved resilience, systems that are able to hold up better, by itself is not enough. Improved mitigation, systems that contribute less to greenhouse gases, by itself is also not enough. We want to have the three things together. Now, that puts a tremendous challenge up to researchers and to the other people that bring these systems together. But at the same time, it helps to resolve this issue of how we look at it. Basically, at this moment, we need to get higher incomes for farmers, at the same time that these systems have a lower ecological footprint. Okay, let's go back to Aaron. He has many more questions.
Sure. So this time we'll try and tackle 3 at once, in part because 2 are sort of a comment and they relate to the question that was asked ultimately. So the question came from Carla Fernandez de Castro of the USAID Knowledge-Driven Agricultural Development Project. And she was curious whether you're aware of any projects or activities that you find replicable in terms of the flexibility of legume growing, where pulses are making actually a successful comeback to both agriculture and nutrition sources. And the 2 related comments to that, one came from Paul Gepts of UC Davis, who perhaps you know, but was mentioning that according to him, they've seen in Rwanda and Burundi the consumption of beans accounting for near 50% of protein intake. And then also Tracy Powell was talking about a project called Mas Frijol in Guatemala with the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for grain legumes, and saying that they are currently promoting consumption of legumes as, quote, heritage crops as a way to work around what might be a stigma that exists that legumes are otherwise a poor man's alternative. And to accomplish this, trying to work through both agriculture extension and rural health workers as sort of a delivery system. So I didn't know, so wrapping back around to Carla's question, maybe that helps answer it, but Dr. Cook, if you had any thoughts or insights, again, on sort of projects that are being effective that also show potential for scale.
Yeah, there are lots and lots of different things that are being tried in legume systems to address some of the challenges that we've talked about this morning. And just as a general comment, clearly solutions that are devised in particular areas will often be applicable in other areas. And I'm not going to claim to have a full understanding of all the different activities, but an example of one would be intercropping. USAID has invested in intercropping in Africa between maize and pigeon pea, for example, a legume that's related to soybean. And the combined system is much more productive. Growing pigeon pea between the rows of maize leads to increased soil nutrition, and therefore that enhances the maize outcomes. It leads to decreased soil erosion, less water loss, higher microbial diversity in the soil, all of which are good things. So the agricultural system becomes more efficient and more productive, which leads to improved farmer income. And in this case, the farmer was a woman, and this has impacted her ability to send her children to school, which has, you can imagine all the other consequences, increased education, opportunities, literally all because of this solution that involves growing a grain, maize, in conjunction with a legume, pigeon pea. And that kind of an approach, in this case intercropping, is one that certainly can be expanded. And there you can see lots of examples where there's an opportunity for that. So I think that the point underlying the question is really a good one, and that is that we will undoubtedly identify solutions that are workable. And this is a long-standing solution that we've known for centuries, just almost sort of forgotten or not being utilized effectively, that can be applied across scales. This is a simple one. It's not high technology, but it has a big impact. So I think reusing scenarios that are successful is a good one. Paul's question, hi Paul, on the beans. I didn't realize that in this case that beans are providing 50% of the protein, nitrogen for humans in their diet. That's amazing. I mean, legumes are certainly capable of doing that. And there's been a big push to bring common bean, which is native to South and Central America, into different parts of the world, but particularly in Africa. And Paul's project has been one of the leaders in this area. And not only in improving access to common bean, but making sure that it grows effectively in these different parts of the world. And this is a good example of where legumes can make a big input and impact, and they can begin to impact those systems in the ways that we know that we can. Tracy Powell from USAID asked about the idea of sort of promoting legumes as heritage crops to sort of make them more attractive. It's really a marketing approach that's being used by USAID, I guess in this case in South America. But I think there are clear analogies to use it elsewhere in the world. In Ethiopia, as an example, the chickpea that's grown there has sort of unique regional characters, and they really have a lot to do with cultural preferences. So, for example, they like a chickpea often that's round. Chickpea's not typically round, but there are genotypes in Ethiopia that are round and small. and dark and flavorful. And so this impacts many, many different things. But if we want to be able to maintain that heritage of those varieties, because it's what the local populations are used to and it's what they want. This goes back to the issue of that I said earlier. We need to realize that solutions in one particular area may not be the solution that's going to be important broadly. And this issue of sort of heritage crops with particular properties tailored to different parts of the world where regional preferences exist is an important one. And the more we maintain and promote those local cultural preferences of populations, the better we're going to be able to sustain legumes in those systems.
I'm looking through the room. I think I saw your hand first. Excuse me.
Sure. In the 1970s, there was this publication called The Protein Fiasco, where everyone began to feel that, protein was not the nutrient that was insufficient in children in developing countries. And that has been challenged recently because that's been an assumption that's been there for the last 2-3 decades, with a couple of publications that have looked at the quality of the amino acids and their relationship to a growth regulatory mechanism in kids. And so I was wondering if you could comment on the amino acid profile in legumes, and what do we know about legume consumption? And you made a lot of relationships to undernutrition in a very broad sense, but I wonder if you could speak more nuance to that if we're looking at consumption related to linear growth or skeletal growth or body mass.
Well, I'm not going to be able to address.
Let's take the other question.
Yep.
Kind of at the same time, and then.
Of course.
So you mentioned that as economies grow, and this is what we've noticed with our projects, as developing countries, people get richer, they tend to turn to animal protein, eggs, dairy, and meat. And this is a trend that is going to continue in emerging markets. And I'm talking about China, India, and Pakistan, and this is going to continue. How can we, and you mentioned some activities that can help us keep some of the demand in these traditional consumers of pulses. But how can we create demand in other places where pulses were not traditionally consumed, like Sub-Saharan Africa, but West Sub-Saharan Africa, where grains are the major crop? How can we encourage, like the example in Rwanda, the rotation of grains and pulses? Because it doesn't, for us at the IFC, it doesn't make a lot of economical sense just because they're not cash crops, and it's for local consumption. It's food security. It's not veggies and fruit and all of that can be exported. And they have specific geographical, topographical characteristics that cannot be, just exported easily. So how can we create the demand in areas where pulses were not consumed before, in an economic sense?
Yeah. So let me, the questions are, the breadth will tax my capacity, so others that have knowledge can pitch in as well. The first one about nutrition and amino acids. Different legumes have different balances of amino acids. Common bean and maize are eaten together so that you have a balanced amino acid profile. Chickpea has a pretty good balance of amino acids and can be eaten as an important part of a vegetarian diet as a consequence. So, I think the answer about balances of amino acids is going to vary depending upon the crops. And I think it would be a mistake, even though I'm talking about legumes, and I guess I'm an advocate for legumes, but I'm not trying to say that legumes are the only solution. And obviously in diet, you need a balanced diet, and that's sort of a high-level general comment, but I think it's absolutely true. Legumes can be very, very important sources of iron, for example. And USDA in Houston, a colleague of mine by the name of Mike Gruzak, has spent a lot of time trying to enhance the iron content of legume seeds, particularly pea, specifically to address particular important micronutrient limitations that affect early human development. So you asked about specific issues like impacts on the skeletal or muscular system, and obviously nutrition, particularly nutrition early in human development, where we affect neural development, is extremely important. But I can't make more substantive comments than that because it'll get into an area that I'm not familiar with. But these are really good questions, and I think it sort of highlights the need. Boy, it'd be great to have a talk from a nutritional biologist or a human physiologist who could talk about these things. We need interdisciplinary discussions to address your question properly. The question about economics and can we increase the use of legumes in different parts of the world? Again, this is going to push on my boundaries a little bit, but let me just say, you mentioned, this won't address your question completely, so maybe it'll elicit another question, but you mentioned the issue that legumes are grown to meet local demand by smallholder farmers, and that they're not often important parts of there isn't big financial incentive. They don't generate new markets and so on. But I actually would assert that's not true at all. And I'll give you two concrete examples of that. One example is Canada, particularly in Saskatoon and Saskatchewan. The income for farmers in Saskatchewan, which has largely been based on grains, is turning to be largely based on legumes in terms of the income per acre, because there's massive potential for the export of high-quality legumes, particularly lentil, where Canada's made a massive, has become the major provider. I think it's 70% of global lentil exports, and it's had a huge impact on the Canadian economy. And chickpea there as well, and they export primarily to India, but also to Pakistan. Similarly, in Ethiopia, where my lab does a fair amount of work, there is a large interest on the part of international, multinational corporations in using the production capacity in Ethiopia to bring chickpea, in particular, elsewhere in the world, particularly for hummus production. So there's a huge opportunity and interest in financial investments in different parts of the world. In this case, Ethiopia, because production systems are relatively low in cost. Chickpea's been there for a long period of time. They have capacity. There are challenges that come with that, right? So when you get that kind of investment and you drive export, you can enhance farmer incomes, but do you impact smallholder farmers that are most at risk? And I would say probably not. And the economists will know a lot more about it than I do, but I think the market of a large industrial farm is quite driving for export and driving up costs, might have negative impacts on smallholder farmers if they were trying to sell into markets. They couldn't compete. There'd be different varieties that were operational and so on. But legumes clearly can be parts and are parts of large, important global markets. And they are commodities that have big financial consequences. How to get the farmers in the developing world connected to that kind of economy, particularly the smallholder farmers, I don't know the answer to the question, but I'm guessing part of it has to do with just development, getting them to not be smallholder farmers anymore. It's not a prize to be a smallholder farmer. It's a problem. And it defines a lot of people, but I think as smallholder farmers, you won't have the connections to markets that you need. And exactly what changes need to occur to make that happen? One, I don't know the answer to the question, but two, I'm guessing it's quite complex, otherwise it would have been solved.
We're coming towards the end of our time together, and I would like to leave the chance for one question from the webinar. So over to Aaron.
Sure, thank you. And this comes from Savannah Henderson, who is a program manager for the Community for Zero Hunger. And she was curious about the potential role and application of pulses in urban agriculture.
Well, I mean, it clearly has. I can't give you any information on the impacts. It's a good question. Quantitatively, I guess part of it has to do with how much urban agriculture happens in different parts of the world. I can't answer the question. I think, growing common beans or chickpea in your garden or in small community gardens is something that certainly happens. I think, I'm just thinking to the parts of the world, Ethiopia in particular, where we focus a lot because chickpea is very important in Ethiopia. Urban agriculture is not not a factor there, really, right? They're more concerned about the more immediate needs and a range of other issues. And agriculture is primarily smallholder farmer. They grow a limited number of crops with small inputs and the sorts of things I had described earlier. But in the developed world, maybe this is a way to impact consumer preferences, is to focus more on the adoption of legumes in urban farming systems. And the comment earlier about heirloom species is the kind of things that urban farmers are ready to adopt, I think. So I think there's a role for urban farming, but my guess is it might actually be more important in terms of sort of consumer acceptance of legumes than in trying to tip the balance of dietary nitrogen, for example.
Doug, thank you very much for your last answer, which was very good again. There are some people that still have questions, but we're running out of time. So what I would like to propose is that the people that are in the room, that they approach Doug afterwards directly, and that the questions that we still have from the webinar are going to pass on in written form to Doug, and that he will follow up. I'd like to make a few kind of closing comments. First of all, I think we've had a super seminar. Where do you get a seminar where one question is about the composition of amino acids, and the next question is about how you can encourage demand in non-traditional markets? It's really fantastic. And Doug has been fielding all the answers. That's maybe even more fantastic. So it's really good. I've been thinking a bit about, what does this mean for the World Bank? It's, after all, the place where I work. Well, I have a few things. I think we should certainly look strongly at increasing the role of legumes in our approaches to climate-smart agriculture. And just, for example, next week I will be traveling to Tanzania on a project where we are improving irrigated systems. We want to diversify in those irrigated systems. So we could really kind of try to encourage that legumes come into those systems on the side of rice. That would be one thing. A second point that we in the World Bank can do is we need to keep on pushing the CGIAR, that they really invest in legumes. And I'm not sure if there is a CRP, a CGIAR research program, but if there isn't, maybe there should be one. A third, those were the 2 points where I think that we can start having kind of immediate, let's say, actions kind of coming on from our side. I wanted to also make a few kind of comments on the passion with which Doug is kind of taking his job. He was working in southern Turkey in 2014 and 15 while the bombs were going off, while that area of the world was on complete fire, and you didn't even mention it. So I thought it was really a kind of a testimony of your commitment to your work, that you were working in that part of the world in those years under those difficult circumstances. Finally, I would like to thank a few people. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody here in the room and everybody on the webinar, because basically you make it a good seminar. There's always a speaker, but the things really become exciting with the questions that are coming up afterwards. And I think we've had an excellent discussion that has been touching on many things. Then I need to thank Aaron and Ira that are sitting here next to me, because those are the ones that really brought the seminar together, that made it work, that also made sure that there was excellent exposure to non-World Bank staff. I saw many people here in the room and also many people online that are not associated with us. And it's really good. We're reaching out here. Everybody's reaching out. And of course, the final person that I have to thank is Doug, who's been delivering an excellent presentation that has allowed for this very enriching discussion. So thanks to all of you, and have a good afternoon.